but we're just going to hit the highlights. Most of you know that November is the time of year that all Ohio public school districts are required to review and adopt their 5-year forecast. It's a requirement of Ohio law, and it includes 3 years of our historical data and 5 years of projections. So the current fiscal year that we're in fiscal year 23, and then an additional 4 fiscal years. It's important to remember that this is a general fund only report. And so when we think about the many other funds that the district uses to run our operations, for example, it doesn't include our permanent improvement fund. So even though that's voted millage, none of those expenditures are included in this forecast. Same with our bond retirement fund, also voted millage, not reflected. So the 5-year forecast across Ohio is a general fund only document for all Ohio public schools. Again, important to remember that we are forecasting a reliable trend, and that's always challenging under normal circumstances. But coming out of the pandemic, it's continued to be more and more difficult. So we are modeling based on the data that we have available, and then we'll talk about the assumptions and where we have areas of maybe more uncertainty than others. And so we like to start with revenue. And when we think about how the 5-year forecast, the document itself is shaped, we start with where the money comes from, and then we move on to how we spend our resources. So we'll start with revenue. And our most material source of revenue is real estate taxes. About 40% of our general fund revenue comes from real estate. And you can see that bottom pie chart, 95% of our tax base is residential. That will not surprise anyone who looks around the community. Of course, we have a very small commercial industrial tax base, about 3%, and an even smaller public utility tax base at 2%. You will see that the forecasted amounts there, the top chart at the top, not forecasting a ton of growth there, because what we know about property taxes and real estate is that once you pass a property tax levy, which our last levy was passed in May of 2017, an 8 mil operating levy, also a 1.5 mil PI levy. But remember, we don't put the permanent improvement fund in this forecast, general fund only. So 8 mils passed in May of 2017. Without any new operating levy in this forecast, there's no growth in that bar chart. Okay. It's important to remember, though, that we will see increases in values during our next cycle of reappraisal. Anybody want to guess what values are going to do? Are they going to go up or down, just based on what we know about home prices here recently? Are values going to go up or down? Up. And so I forecasted an increase in property values. And so remember, Ohio law provides that when property values go up, the millage rate goes down, because you're not allowed to collect more than the original levy was intended to collect. So this forecast does assume property tax growth, and you'll see that next year during reappraisal, I'm projecting some pretty material growth, and you can see it forecasted there. But you can also see then the millage rate going down because of the way that House Bill 920 impacts effective millage rate in Ohio. I know that property tax millage is everybody's favorite topic. So real estate taxes are most material source of revenue. We're going to move on to our second most material source of revenue. I'm going to go back to this pie chart. So property tax at 40%, income tax at 32%. So we're 72% local funded. Okay, that's important to remember. Just if you kind of just think about the structure of our revenue. Real estate taxes at 40%, balanced with income tax at 32%, so 72% locally funded. And that bar chart looks a little different than the property tax chart, because there's no protection, so to speak, in the way that there's protection in the way Ohio millage structure works. So there are 2 income taxes that have been passed in Wyoming, one in 1989 and then a second one in 1994. So we are currently collecting 1.25% income tax on total income. If the law has since changed, so there are some districts now who are levying or putting on the ballot an income tax, and school districts now have the option to run an earned income tax. That wasn't an option back when ours were passed. So ours are the income tax. The school income tax here is on total income. The difference is being mostly pension income would be the difference. So school districts are passing those now, and they decide you can still have the option. You can do all income or earned, but the option would be that it's earned income versus pension income is the biggest exception. So we've certainly seen some growth in this line item, which has helped our financial stability, but we've also seen some volatility in this line item. So if you look just at that kind of the 22-year average, historical average, our average growth over those years is about 3.19%. We have had some recent anomalies coming out of COVID. Fiscal year 21, we actually saw a 0.74% decline. Less than 1% is about as close to a flat line as you can get. And we were actually pretty happy with that because coming out of COVID, we were actually forecasting a 5% decline just due to real uncertainty about what was happening in the Ohio economy at the time. So about a flat line in 21, did see, we had then forecasted again, coming out of COVID with much uncertainty, we've been forecasting 1.5% growth, actually realized about 10% growth. So we saw a really healthy rebound in our income tax collection for fiscal year 22. So far, through half of our collection, we've received 2 of our 4 payments. We've seen a 16% growth, but we have seen the first 2 payments are normally the largest generators of that growth. The second half of the fiscal year normally backs off a little bit. So we have in this forecasted for this year, a 6% increase. And then modeled out in the future of 3%. We had been, if you remember, we'd been hovering around 2.5, but because of these recent increases, we adjusted it up to 3. I say that also, I feel like it's important to follow that we are continuing to monitor this line item very, very carefully. My friends who are on finance committee know that every time we have a payment, we spend an hour or so talking, kind of diving into the details and the components of our income tax collection, because it's very material to our forecast. And, the volatility is something that should it take a turn one way or the other, it would have an impact on our cash balance, and it would have a material impact on our cash balance. And so we also know that there are lots of economic factors that are happening in the world, in our country, in our state. There's so much going on that could influence this that really is beyond our control. Also, taxpayer behavior is beyond our control. So, folks make decisions about investments or buying and selling companies or changing jobs. And so, all of that taxpayer behavior happens, all of the state and local and national economy, all of those factors are influencing how this collection takes shape. And so I just feel like it's important to say that because that would absolutely influence the way that this curve takes shape over the next few years.
Running real fast. Could you I always like when you reiterate or go into tiny detail right where your cursor was. I think the biggest question I get, but then I always ask you, so I like to hear you say it again, is the 1.25 of like the backup past, because I think some people, it's just confusing for people in the community. Sometimes you're like, why am I paying a 1.25 school tax? What is that? And then all the time for me, it's like, I love to hear it a million times.
Sure.
I think I get it, but I like to hear you say
Sure.
it.
And so, school districts, the tax structure in Ohio is that school districts had property taxes, cities had income taxes, counties had sales tax. Okay, that's sort of the overall tax structure in Ohio. And so at some point, the law was changed and said, okay, school districts can levy, put to your voters and ask for support of a school district income tax. It does help to diversify your tax base, because what did we know about property taxes? There's no growth, right? Despite the fact that property values in this community could double. And we would still not see any additional revenue because of the way that Ohio law requires that millage rate to drop. I know effective millage rate, again, is everybody's least favorite topic, but values go up, the millage rate has to go down because Ohio law says that when you pass a property tax, you're limited from the collection from that issue. No matter how much property values go up, you cannot generate additional revenue. So I think it was fairly wise for the board back in 89 and again in 94 to say, what, it would be helpful for our revenue structure to maybe diversify our revenue stream. And so that this has helped us quite a bit. And so as a voter, when you're thinking about this, you think, okay, I could be paying this property tax or I could be paying this income tax. And so at some point it made sense to our voters to approve that and the diversification of that and how they pay it. Any other questions? I mean, they're very different. But again, important to know that combined together, about 72% local funded. Right. So property tax, the most material, income tax, the second most. We are creeping up there, though. I mean, as you know, as we continue to see growth, healthy growth in our income tax, I mean, it's continuing to creep up. I mean, a few years ago, it was maybe, 28, 29%, and now it's continuing to grow a little more. Part of that is because of the next factor, which is state funding, which has not continued to grow. And so state funding is about 20% of our total revenue. You might have heard that there was a new fair school funding plan. It was debated for a couple of years, passed by the Ohio legislature. Year one was last year. Year two is this year. This is the second year of the biennium. The state budgets in 2-year cycles. So the biennium budget cycle, it is currently in the model is being phased in. But really, what our constituents need to know about this is the new fair school funding plan is not generating additional state funding for Wyoming city schools. In fact, this year we are forecasted to receive 5.8 million. That number looks eerily similar to the amount of state funding we received in fiscal year 19. In fact, just a bit shy. So, 2 biennium budgets ago, 4 years ago, we were receiving more in state funding than we were slated to get in the new model. And so interesting just to kind of pay attention to what has happened over the past few years. This is another line item that we took a hit during COVID. If you remember, COVID hit and we shut down in March of 2020. It was maybe 30 to 45 days after that the state actually cut our funding 3/4 of the way through the school year. And which was, really a big deal. Like that just doesn't happen.
Right.
And so you can see that reduction. And then we saw, a little bit of a rebound, but that rebound in 21 isn't necessarily funding growth. It's just the rebound from the cut of the year before. Right. And so, that's why it's important that you almost have to kind of go back to fiscal year 19. You kind of have to go back to pre-COVID levels, to see where you land in the funding formula compared to the previous formula. You kind of have to box out those COVID years because the state, again, same reason that we were forecasting uncertainty in our income tax, they were forecasting uncertainty and had to pull back a little bit. And so the moral of the story here is 20% of our overall revenue stream, not forecasting any growth at all over the life of this forecast. As we continue to lobby and advocate through this next biennium budget cycle, I honestly think that we're just really trying to hang on to the $5.8 million that we have, make sure that it's not diverted to school choice. That really is our number one effort over the next 6 to 7 months when the new biennium budget hits on July 1st.
Right.
Okay. Maybe worth mentioning that in the new fair school funding plan that there are some restricted funds. So although we were receiving the same amount of money, in fact, a little bit less, we're required to spend that money in a certain way. So that's new. And that's kind of that little green section of the graph. Not super material for us, but maybe just worth mentioning that as we sort of move along, we get less money, more mandates. Okay, which is kind of the moral of the story of state funding.
What do those things have to go to?
So a big chunk of that, a few years ago, we sort of got a dump of money that was for wellness, and it was on top of our regular allocation. Well, they abandoned that model and said, hey, we're just going to slide this into your state allocation, and you're still required to spend it on those funds. There's a gifted allocation. There's an ESL, an English as a second language allocation. We get such small amounts of all of those little pieces that we really have no trouble proving or documenting or substantiating that we're spending those funds on those programs, because we were doing that anyway. But it's just, I'm a local control gal. And so I'm always opposed to less money and more mandates. It's just kind of in my nature. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to this main graph. We've kind of hit the highlights of revenue. Okay, we do have a few small other little pieces. Real estate tax, most material at 40%, then income tax at 32%, state funding 20%, not going to grow, forecasted to stay flatline. About 4.5% for property tax allocation. That's more commonly known as homestead and rollback. So the state pays a portion of your property taxes, either 10% or 2.5% if you qualify for those homestead and rollback exemptions, those programs. So the state gives us that money. And then about 3% other. And other is, our all-day kindergarten tuition. We receive about $350,000 in all-day kindergarten tuition, fees, instructional fees, really a small bucket. So again, mostly real estate taxes and income tax. So if we think about now, we understand where our revenue stream comes from. Where does our money come from? What do we do with it when we get it? And so, again, consistent with public school districts across the state, about 81% of our budget we spend on salaries and benefits. And that includes salaries and benefits for about 230 staff members. So including, of course, our teachers and educational aides, the in-house custodial and maintenance staff that we have, and building and district level administration. Again, that benchmark is consistent between 80 and 85% across the state. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because that's what school districts do. We hire staff members to serve our kids. Okay, so we're not, you've heard me use this example before. We don't, buy raw materials and put them through some sort of process and have a cost of goods sold and make something. That isn't the source of our expenditures. We hire staff members to serve our students and our buildings and our school community. And so we're right on that benchmark. I have forecasted some growth in both of those line items over the next 5 years. We are seeing some inflationary pressure on things like health insurance. So that could be one of those areas that might take a turn, maybe a little higher than what I have forecasted. Also, maybe worth mentioning that this forecast assumes current contributions to both STRS and SCRS. There is, there has been a bill introduced that would increase the district's contribution towards the state teachers retirement system. Hasn't had any movement yet, but again, that would be something that if it's passed is not included in this forecast and would have a material impact on our expenditures. So it's important to know what's in there, and sometimes more important to know what's not. Okay, so it assumes current law, current structures, a trend increase on health insurance, but those things are all just kind of taking shape in different ways. So about 80%, 81% on salaries and benefits. The next biggest piece of our expenditures is something that we call purchase services. And I know that's kind of like treasurer lingo. And so I tried to spell some of that out for you and give you some examples. And so I like to think of this similar to you would think of fixed costs in your home. So, we have to pay utilities. You have to pay utilities in your home. You have to have insurance. We have to have insurance. Some other fixed costs for us are things like transportation. We don't transport our high school students, and we transport our K-8 students outside of 1.25 miles. But so we're not quite at state minimum transportation because state minimum is 2 miles. But we don't transport. Why am I having trouble with that word? We don't transport.
Run with it.
We don't transport our high school students. So I share that with you because some of these items, in districts, not us because we haven't been in this position, but if districts find themselves in a position where you have to cut costs, normally something like transportation is the first piece of the dialogue. Right. Well, this district made that choice 40 years ago. Okay, so we at Wyoming has traditionally been a district that focuses their resources on instruction. And so I think that you see that show up in and it's aligned to our strategic plan, but you see it show up in a couple different ways on this forecast. Transportation is one of those things, a difficult decision, but also allows you to prioritize resources towards instruction. Other pieces of things that we like to think about in terms of fixed costs. We don't hire all of our maintenance and custodial staff in-house. We do some, but again, did an analysis and realized that we had some cost savings opportunity by doing that, outsourcing some of those positions through attrition. So as folks either resign or retire, then we shift over to the contracting those services. That's a purchase service. Same with our technology services. We partnered a few years ago, with a technology team that is best practice first in class and serving the education market for many, many years. And so we don't hire those folks in-house. We purchase that service. Substitute procurement is a big one. You can see it up there, about $275,000. We partner with the Hamilton County ESC to procure our subs for us. And so that necessarily wasn't a cost savings measure from the get-go, but ends up being a cost savings measure because we didn't have the capacity to continue to do that in-house. I mean, that's just a really big job. And so they have a system to do that. And then there are some student services there. And then you can see, I tried to break those down for you a little bit, the mandated college credit plus, we don't house a preschool here in Wyoming City Schools. So we contract for preschool services. Folks might be surprised to know that, we pay out about $100,000 for our students to take AP exams. You see that on the revenue side, that was part of miscellaneous revenue, but it shows up on the expense side too. And then we have some students who are placed at other options that are the best place for them to receive their education. So those are things that we purchase. For utilities, again, a fixed cost in your own home for us, just to give you perspective, about $620,000. Transportation, about $500,000. That's total transportation. Again, you can see some of those dollars there. Just trying to give you a little bit of perspective of, of things that show up and sort of the threshold that ends up being in this line item. You will see that I have forecasted an increase. I mean, it's a double-digit increase in 2023. Again, we're seeing inflationary pressure on those costs. So the appropriation this year is higher. Also, we've moved some positions from in-house to outsource. More so this year because of attrition and resignations than we have in the past couple of years. And then, there's really not much left when we think about, 81% salaries and benefits, and then 12%, purchase services and those other fixed costs for us. So materials and supplies and capital outlay. And that's kind of the stuff that our staff members use to work with kids, about 3% overall of our budget. We have increased the appropriation this year and through the life of the forecast. That can be attributed mostly to our textbook cycle. I think we realized when we went through the cycle last year that budget number was a little low, and we were having a hard time meeting the request of the textbook adoption committees with the budget that we had allocated. So we increased the allocation a little bit this year, and actually remind me what subject we're doing this year.
ELA.
And so language arts is also normally a little bit more expensive of an adoption. So it was important that we, have a more realistic budget number in there for this year than kind of where we started last year. And inflationary growth. Despite the fact that you get the online version of the textbook and maybe not the textbook, it's not any cheaper. So, which is crazy. Continue to monitor that moving forward. And then on the capital outlay side, this is really about our technology plan, both devices and infrastructure. And you can see 22 and 23 are lower cost years, and then 24 through 27 rebound a little bit. 22 and 23, we did use federal COVID money. Some of it was required to be used for some of the technology pieces. And if you think about what was going on during that time, that makes complete total sense. And so we had some of that, absolutely the devices, but we also had the infrastructure and our technology plan. And we just kind of maybe sped up some of those decisions because we had to use those dollars, and it helped prepare both our middle school and our high school. We've been very deliberate about how we're allocating resources to the primary as we embark on a primary facility plan. But that's why the general fund dollars in 22 and 23 on capital outlay are a little bit lower, because those were supplemented by federal COVID relief dollars.
Some of these expenses, for example, the technology purchases, I assume that's laptops that students get. Of course, the students are getting have a fee assessed as well.
Yes.
Is that a pass through where their fee goes into a general fund and then?
Yeah. So when we looked at that little 3% revenue, the instructional fees that are assigned to the students are part of that revenue, and so that happens at the high school. It does not happen at the middle school and primary. Right. Okay.
Same way with AP exams. Like
Same way with AP, they pay a fee.
It gets that's part of that 3%.
Yep. So it shows up on the expense side, but it also shows up on the revenue side. It ends up just being a really small part of our revenue stream. Yeah. And so when we feed all of this in together, it all boils down to what is our cash balance. And so when we think about fiscal year 23, we started fiscal year 23 with about $8.8 million. And we're forecasting to receive total revenue, everything that we talked about on the revenue side, about $28.87 million. Expenses we're forecasting at about $29 million. And so, pretty pretty close to being spot on, but a little bit of a revenue deficit, about $130,000. So forecasting to end fiscal year 23 with about 8.7 million. We know that we're closely monitoring that bottom cash balance line in alignment with our cash balance policy. So our targeted cash balance is
5 million.
5 million. And we use that as a benchmark that says that when we get close to $5 million, we need to make some decisions. We need to say, okay, we either need to raise revenue or we need to reduce expenditures or some combination of both. And so 5 million is our target to make sure that we are having conversations about what's happening on the revenue side and the expense side to impact that cash balance benchmark. And so some caveats at the bottom. We are very carefully watching economic indicators, state and local revenue, state as we move towards the biennium budget cycle. Local revenue, we know that the big trigger on our end is income tax. And again, carefully monitoring how much inflationary pressure we continue to get on our expenditures. We did have some COVID relief dollars. We do still have some left. They are restricted for learning recovery. We're moving through those. We ran some summer programs. We're running some after school programs. We'll run more summer programs next summer. So what's left is restricted. And so we'll continue to move forward with those. They have a September 30th, 2024 expiration date. So we'll continue to spend down those COVID relief dollars in accordance with the restricted funds. At this point, if you look at the cash balance, and using $5 million as the benchmark, that would tell you that perhaps we need to be thinking about new money, collecting new money, full new money sometime in 26.
Mm-hmm.
So that would lead me to believe that we need to be looking for new money in 24 or 25. There is a path to that allows for a phase in, and given our expenditures and the slope of our cash balance, I feel like that might be a good solution for us. We're still a little bit away yet, so we'll continue to watch the second half of income tax, carefully watch the biennium budget cycle, again, pay attention to inflationary pressure on expenditures. And then, we're also, as we saw earlier tonight, we're, working towards a primary facility master plan that, would impact the way that some of these look too, depending on, how the structure of the primary ends up looking. So, looking towards that alignment as we move to the next, kind of 2 to 3 years. But, overall, in the short term, really strong forecast. Given all the caveats that I mentioned. Income tax is always the biggest trigger for us. But, I feel like our assumptions are, I feel good about them. We've debated them at length in finance committee, and I feel pretty good about where we are with them this year. So
I don't feel like the levy is almost further along. We knew it was coming. I feel like, at least for us, when COVID hit, it was a little more nerve-wracking for a second, right? Of not knowing recovery and not knowing how we stretch it. Just to look at it.
Well, I think it's important to remember. I mean, we if you look at those two chunks of federal COVID dollars, that's $1.9 million. I mean, those we haven't spent all of that so far, but that helped. I mean, we were able to shift some expenditures, things that we needed to do and wanted to do and were important to the different plans that we had in different buildings.
Correct.
Absolutely supported that cash balance. And allowed us to have a little more financial stability during that time. So it was important.
Well, there was a period too when the state said we're cutting state funding, which had never, ever happened before.
Like when you said that, they cut it and then you didn't know what we were getting.
And we had no idea what to expect.
We had no idea what to expect. No idea what to expect. Yeah, I mean, that happened in May. Our fiscal year ends June 30th.
Right.
I mean, we were 10, 12 through the school year.
Right.
10, 12 through the fiscal year. Right. And they say, hey, you're going to get a 5, I don't remember the percentage now. I think I blocked it.
It was enough that you almost went through a period of, well, we have to write a check to the state.
I think some districts absolutely got that.
Do we have to pay them back?
Yeah. Yeah.
The money we've already spent.
Well, all right. Thank you.